Delivery guy was yelled at for being late, but what the millionaire did next shocked him. It sounds like just another headline, but behind those words lies a story of anger, exhaustion, and an unexpected act of humanity that no one saw coming. Sparkles, before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop in the comments below. I'd love to know. Now let's begin. It was midday, but for Elias Moreno, the sun felt heavier than comforting. Its brightness only revealed the sweat on his forehead, the dust clinging to his faded uniform, and the exhaustion etched into his tired frame. His sneakers, worn thin from endless deliveries, scraped against polished floors as he climbed higher. The elevator was out of order, so he had trudged flight after flight, balancing the warm food bag that seemed to grow heavier with each step. At last, he reached it, the very top, the penthouse, its gleaming door a stark contrast to the sweat dripping down his temples. He paused, just for a moment, because behind this door lived Victor Hale, not just another customer, but a man whose name carried both fortune and fury. Elias lifted his hand. His knuckles hovered against the sleek wooden door, hesitant, as if he already knew trouble was waiting on the other side. Then he knocked. The sound echoed down the quiet hallway, swallowed by the stillness of luxury. Seconds dragged. Footsteps followed. Quick, sharp, impatient. The door flung open. Victor Hale stood there, sunlight from the wide windows behind him catching the sharp edges of his suit. His eyes were cold, his jaw set like stone, every line of his face radiating control and irritation. The silence broke with a single word, snapped like a command. You're late. In that instant, one man's fury met another man's weariness. And what began as just another delivery was about to change everything. Elias Moreno wasn't the kind of man people noticed. Not on the crowded streets, not in the rush of the city. He blended in, the quiet figure on a bicycle, zigzagging through traffic with a food bag strapped to his back. But behind that ordinary uniform was a story that weighed far heavier than any delivery. Elias had been working since dawn, 10 hours on his feet already, yet this order, the one in his hands, wasn't the last. His sneakers, frayed at the edges, told their own story. Each scuff line, each thinning sole, was proof of miles traveled for a living that barely paid the rent. Rent. That was always the word echoing in his mind. Bills stacked like bricks. And a landlord whose patience was thinning by the day. At home, in his small apartment, his mother's old photograph rested on a shelf. The one person who had once reminded him to keep going no matter how hard. But she was gone now, and all that remained was the echo of her words and the responsibility she left behind. You see, Elias wasn't just working for himself. His younger sister, still in school, depended on him. He was the one keeping the lights on, keeping food on the table, making sure she had at least a chance at the future he never had. And so every morning, he laced up those torn shoes. Every afternoon, he pushed past the ache in his legs. Every evening, he told himself he'd get through one more day. Still, the world didn't make it easy. Traffic fines, flat tires, rude customers. They added up. Sometimes Elias wondered if anyone ever saw the human being behind the delivery bag, but he kept going because he had to. And now, after climbing flight after flight of stairs, his body begged him to stop. His chest rose and fell heavily, his shirt clinging to him from sweat. The sunlight pouring through the hallway windows felt almost cruel, as if it was watching his struggle without offering warmth. Elias Moreno stood outside the penthouse door, a man carrying far more than food. He carried exhaustion, responsibility, and a quiet dignity that refused to break. Even when the world seemed determined to crush him, he took a breath, lifted his hand, and knocked. What waited on the other side would test him in ways he never imagined. The door stood open, and for a moment, Elias felt blinded, not by the sunlight, but by the world inside. Victor Hale's penthouse stretched out like another planet. Marble floors that gleamed walls lined with art whose price tags could have paid Elias's rent for a year, crystal fixtures hanging from the ceiling, catching daylight like drops of fire. For a man used to cramped apartments and dim stairwells, this sight was almost unreal. It was wealth made visible, wealth so sharp it cut. And there at the center of it all stood Victor, tall, tailored, every detail in place. His cufflinks caught the light. His voice carried the weight of someone never questioned. He looked at Elias as if measuring not just a delivery, but the man holding it. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, polished shoes, untouched by the dirt of the streets. On the other, sneakers worn thin, soles nearly giving out. Two men, two worlds, colliding in silence. Victor's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening as though Elias's presence had disrupted the perfection of his space. The penthouse was order, Elias was struggle, and the distance between them felt like miles. Even though only a doorway separated the two, Elias lowered his eyes, murmuring an apology that barely reached the air. His voice was soft, but it carried the exhaustion of someone who had apologized far too many times in life. Victor didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, studying the man in front of him, the sweat on his brow, the way he shifted his weight from one aching foot to the other. The silence stretched long enough to sting. Elias could feel it, that crushing awareness of not belonging, not in this world of glass and steel, not in this life built on power and control. And yet, for reasons even Victor couldn't name in that moment, something in that silence began to shift. Victor's patience snapped first. His voice cut through the polished air of the penthouse like glass shattering. "You're late. Do you have any idea how much my time is worth?" The word struck hard, sharp as a blade. Elias flinched, though not visibly. It wasn't the first time he had been yelled at for being late. But here, in this glittering world of power and wealth, the weight of those words felt even heavier. Elias lowered his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. The elevator wasn't working. I had to climb the stairs." But his apology only seemed to fuel the fire. Victor's jaw tightened, his hand slicing through the air as he spoke. "Excuses. Always excuses. Do you think I'm paying for your struggle? Do you think anyone cares how many stairs you climbed? I asked for food delivered on time. That's it." The words echoed, bouncing off marble floors and high ceilings. Cold, unforgiving. And yet, Elias didn't fight back. He didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself with the anger he surely carried inside. Instead, he simply stood there, his head bowed slightly, his hands tightening around the delivery bag. His silence was not weakness. It was weariness, the kind of silence a man learns when life has shouted at him too many times already. Victor stared at him, waiting for resistance, waiting for a spark of defiance, something to justify the sharp edge of his temper. But none came, only a quiet nod, a heavy breath, a delivery man too tired to fight back. And for reasons Victor could not explain, that silence unsettled him. He had built his life on control, on commanding, demanding, expecting the world to bend. But here stood a man who did not bend out of fear. He simply had no strength left to resist. Victor's anger faltered just for a moment, because what he saw in Elias's eyes was not defiance, but exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion money could never buy its way out of. The clash between fury and weariness hung in the air, thick, unspoken, almost unbearable. And deep inside, something in Victor Hale began to shift. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Victor stood rigid, his words still hanging in the air like smoke after fire. Elias, head bowed, waited silently, ready for the door to slam in his face. But then something unexpected happened. Victor's eyes lingered on the sweat dripping down Elias's temples, on the way his shoulders sagged, not in laziness, but in exhaustion that only comes from carrying too much for far too long. And somewhere beneath the steel armor of his temper, a crack appeared. Victor drew in a slow breath, his jaw loosening, his voice quieter than before. Sit down. Elias blinked. Had he heard right? He looked up cautiously, unsure if it was an order or a mockery. Victor stepped aside, gesturing toward the polished interior of the penthouse, the very world Elias had no place in. Confused, Elias hesitated at the doorway, his hand still gripping the delivery bag like a shield. Victor's tone softened further, though his eyes stayed sharp. Come in. You look like you haven't eaten all day. The word struck Elias harder than the anger had, because kindness, especially from a man like Victor Hale, was the last thing he expected. Slowly, carefully, Elias stepped inside. His worn sneakers squeaked against the marble, his presence small in the vastness of the penthouse. The distance between their worlds suddenly felt narrower, and yet wider than ever. Victor took the bag from his hands, placed it on the glass table, and with a strange gentleness, began setting out the food. Elias watched in silence, still bracing for a trick, a cruel laugh, or a harsh word waiting to follow. But none came. Instead, Victor motioned toward the chair opposite his own. Sit, eat. You need it more than I do. And in that single gesture, in that unexpected invitation, the air inside the penthouse shifted. What began with fury was becoming something neither of them had planned. The table between them was more than just glass and steel. It was a line, a barrier between two very different lives. On one side, Victor Hale, the millionaire, polished, powerful, a man whose name opened doors. On the other, Elias Moreno, tired, ordinary, a man who spent his days opening doors for others. The food sat steaming between them, but for a long while neither reached for it. Silence lingered, not sharp this time, but heavy, uncertain. Finally, Victor broke it. His voice had lost its edge, replaced by a measured curiosity. You've been running all day, haven't you? Elias hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Since the morning. Victor leaned back, studying him. And what do you get for it? A few dollars? Enough to keep going. Elias's eyes flickered downward. He didn't want to complain, but the truth pressed its way out. Enough to keep the lights on. Most days. Enough so my sister doesn't have to worry about food. She's still in school. The words were simple, but they carried weight. The weight of sacrifice. The weight of love unspoken. Victor's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. A memory stirred. His own younger years, long before the marble floors and crystal lights, when he too had worked to prove he belonged somewhere. Elias pushed the food toward him. You should eat, sir. It's your order. But Victor shook his head. No, you first. Elias froze. He wasn't used to being served kindness. Not in this job. Not in this city. Slowly, cautiously, he picked up a fork. The smell of warm food filled his senses. A meal he could never afford for himself. And as he ate, Victor spoke again. What's it like, working every day like this? Elias swallowed hard. It's tiring, but it's honest, and it keeps me moving, keeps her safe. He paused and added quietly, sometimes I just wish people saw more than delivery guy. The honesty in his voice was raw, unpolished. It carried no bitterness, only the quiet ache of being invisible. Victor didn't respond right away. He simply sat there, watching this man across the table, a man who had walked miles for strangers and asked nothing in return but enough to survive. The air between them changed. The distance of wealth and struggle began to shrink, and for the first time in years, Victor Hale felt something stir inside him, something he had long buried beneath profit margins and meetings, a reminder of his own humanity. Victor Hale sat in silence, watching Elias eat as if it were the first real meal he'd had in days. The millionaire's hand rested on the table, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. For years, his life had been a fortress of glass towers and boardrooms, of sharp suits and sharper deals. He had built an empire brick by brick, climbing over obstacles, outlasting rivals, burying weakness beneath ambition. And it had worked. On paper, Victor Hale had everything: The penthouse, the wealth, the reputation. He was the man people envied and feared. But as he sat across from Elias Moreno, something uncomfortable stirred inside him, because once, long before the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, Victor had known that same exhaustion. He remembered long nights, studying by dim light in a cramped apartment. He remembered the ache in his hands from loading crates, the sting of rejection when doors closed in his face. He remembered hunger, real hunger, the kind that gnaws at your ribs and makes the world feel colder. And now, looking at Elias, he saw not just a delivery man, but a reflection, a mirror of who he had once been. Victor leaned back, his gaze unfocused, his voice lower, moored himself into Elias. You remind me of a time I tried hard to forget. Elias looked up, confused, but Victor didn't explain further. He couldn't, not yet, because to admit it out loud would mean facing a truth he had buried, that in chasing success, he had lost touch with the very struggle that once defined him. The clink of silverware against the plate brought him back. Elias, quietly finishing his meal, still looked small against the vastness of the penthouse. Victor studied him one more time, and in that quiet moment, the walls he had built around himself began to crack. The last bite of food disappeared, and for a moment, silence filled the penthouse. Elias pushed the plate forward, his hands folding in his lap, his eyes cast down, as though he'd overstayed his welcome. He whispered softly, "Thank you, sir. I should go." Victor's eyes lingered on him. That quiet humility, that constant apologizing for simply existing, it unsettled him. He leaned forward, his voice measured, yet carrying something unexpected. "Tell me, Elias, is this what you want to do for the rest of your life? Riding through traffic, climbing stairs, being yelled at for things beyond your control?" Elias hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He gave a small, weary shrug. "It's work, and work is what keeps us alive." Victor studied him. A long pause, a flicker of something softer in his expression, and then words spilled from his lips that surprised even him. "What if I offered you something better?" Elias blinked. He wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "Better, sir?" Victor nodded slowly. "I don't need another delivery. I need someone I can trust. A driver. Someone reliable. Someone like you." The words hung heavy in the air. Elias's heart raced. Surely this was a joke. Men like him didn't receive offers like that. Not from men like Victor Hale. He shook his head, stammering, "Sir, I'm nobody." But Victor leaned closer, his tone firm, unshaken. "No, you're not nobody. I see a man who shows up even when the world makes it harder every day. I see a man who works until his body gives out, yet still keeps going. That is not nobody." Elias's throat tightened, his eyes burning with a sting he hadn't felt in years. Respect, dignity, words he had long stopped expecting to hear. Victor rested his hand flat on the table, his offer plain, unwavering. "Come work for me, not as a delivery man, as my driver, with fair pay, benefits, and the respect you deserve." Elias sat frozen, his breath shallow, his mind unable to catch up with the moment, because in the span of a single meal, his life had been handed a door he never imagined could open. And for the first time in years, hope flickered. Elias sat frozen in his chair. The words still echoed in his mind. "Come work for me with dignity." For a man used to rejection, it felt impossible. Like hearing a language he had never been taught to believe in. His lips parted, but no words came, only a quiet tremor of disbelief. Victor leaned forward, steady, unwavering. "I don't make offers twice, Elias. Do you want this chance?" Elias swallowed hard, his chest tightened, his fingers curling against the edge of the table. Then, with a voice trembling, barely more than a whisper, he said, "Yes." The single word carried years of struggle, years of exhaustion, years of hope buried beneath survival. Victor extended his hand across the table. Elias hesitated, then placed his own calloused, weary hand into Victor's. For a moment, the penthouse seemed quieter than ever. Two men whirled apart, connected by one decision. Elias's eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with relief, with the first spark of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. In that handshake, his life shifted from just another delivery to the beginning of a new chapter. Sometimes life changes with the simplest of actions, not in boardrooms, not in grand speeches, but in something as ordinary as a knock on a door. Elias Moreno thought it was just another delivery, another climb, another apology waiting to happen. Victor Hale thought it was just another interruption, another late order, another reason to be angry. But in that moment, when weariness met fury, when silence spoke louder than excuses, something shifted. One man remembered his own beginnings. The other was given a chance to start anew. By the end of that day, a delivery bag had been set aside, and in its place stood an opportunity, a second chance, a door opening to dignity, respect, and hope. And it all began with a single knock, because sometimes the smallest encounters, the ones we barely notice, carry the power to change everything. And if the story moved you, remember to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV, because more stories like this one are waiting to be told.